So, David, you know what today is? Today's April 4th. What's April 4th?
Oh, it's not April Fool's Day. No, it
No,
is
it's not April
the
Fool's.
anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death.
It is absolutely the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th. I believe it was 1968. Is that correct? I believe it is. And as we are now engaged, as we are seeing this new rise in protest culture, as more and more people are becoming politically active, engaging in acts of protest and demonstration, I think it's really important to go back and and engage with the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, I would argue that it's more important to engage with his legacy on the day of his assassination than it is to engage with it on the day of his his birth. But we all celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. in January the 16th, although some people are against even that being a holiday. John McCain. Sorry, I had racist in my throat. That was a really bad joke. Anyway, so in engaging with Martin Luther King Jr.'s actual legacy, we have to also engage with how he's been in some ways whitewashed and defanged. Both him and his message have kind of lost their bite as both liberals and conservatives seek to co-opt his legacy, seek to co-opt his movement and make it sort of suit their needs. All right, so and one of the big ways we see this is with the removal of MLK's class analysis, the reduction of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and his critique on American society as being one entirely based on the discrepancies between white and black people. And in a lot of ways, this is this erasure of class as one of his key critiques has become a dominant part of the liberal narrative around Martin Luther King Jr. And so we hear quotes every year. We hear his "I Have a Dream" speech every year, but we don't hear some of these quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. Some of them, his ones that were more entrenched in class analysis. So I'm going to read you a few of his, less known quotes. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. Now, he said that on August 16th of 1967. Similar quotes here. In a sense, you could say we're involved in the class struggle. I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with the noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. This was back in 1952. So Martin Luther King Jr. was, delivering a class analysis of the poverty and structural inequality that the black people were facing back then. And now in 2017, as we grapple with his legacy, both on the day of his assassination and the anniversary of his birth, an entirely different Martin Luther King Jr., one that was more focused on a very milquetoast critique of race relations, identitarian relationships between black and white people that are divorced from the way, the broader economy affects that thing. Furthermore, we see this false dichotomy being constructed between MLK and Malcolm X as it relates to violence and protest. So Martin Luther King Jr. is known for saying that, riots are a language of the unheard, that riots are not really to be blamed on the rioters, but in fact on the structural inequality that the rioters are actually rioting against. That it's the reflection of a society that is not hearing these people's demands for change. And am I wrong? Am I wrong, David? Am I wrong in lobbying this critique that liberals and conservatives have reconstructed Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy?
Absolutely not. I mean, what argument really based in fact, if they dig down, could they really come up to say that you are wrong? I mean, it's when you really look at Martin Luther King Jr., it's pretty plain that what we're taught in schools or what's popularized about him is completely made vague on purpose.
I mean, yeah, it's made vague, right? Like that's the thing. Like it's made into this kind of it's the exact same rhetoric we hear from Democratic leaders right now. It's the exact sort of rhetoric that we heard from President Obama for 8 years about the need for Black people to kind of themselves up out of the shackles of oppression, but not really grappling with what those shackles are made of. Right? Like it's a pointing out of the fact that there exists structural inequality, but not getting to the foundations of what that lies at. It's not about erasing race. It's about grappling with the foundations of racism and the foundations of inequality. And nowadays we have liberal concern trolling over whether or not the tactics of modern protests are contiguous with what Martin King Jr. wanted. And this is why it's important to actually engage with Martin King Jr.'s legacy, because this false Martin King Jr., this imagined civil rights leader who acts quietly and was so pro nonviolence and pacifist that he would be admonishing the Antifa and Black Bloc of today who are engaging in, militant activism, is used as basically Martin King Jr. is used as a cudgel against those who are now engaging in activism as the sort of standard bearer for what activism should look like. But it's not even really him. It's an imagined Martin King Jr. It's a imagined civil rights movement, really. People who point to the tactics of today are comparing them to tactics that never really existed. It's the functional equivalent of they're basically saying make protests great again, right? It's this idea that protests now are disrespectful of the mentality of the world's best protester, when in reality, Martin King Jr., if he was the way people present him in the in history books right now, if he was actually the way, he probably wouldn't have been assassinated. Right? His socialist message was, his class analysis was what made him incredibly dangerous. His desire to actually, cost money to the people who hold the means of production is what made him a dangerous threat. And today we have this disrespectful tweet from the FBI, right? So I think a lot of people were up in arms about a tweet by the FBI, honoring Martin King Jr. Day, his assassination, as though people have forgotten that 49 years ago, the FBI was trying to blackmail Martin King Jr. into committing suicide. It's just like that Hoover personally was harassing Martin King Jr. on behest of the state. And it really comes down to this notion of what is respectability politics in protesting, and how has Martin King Jr.'s legacy been corrupted and co-opted by those who are trying to maintain the status quo and trying to stop any sort of legitimate change in society. And the answer is respectability politics in protesting, whether we're talking about Martin King Jr., we're talking about whoever is leading protests today, whether it be Linda Sarsour, Angela Davis, DeRay, I guess. Respectability politics is not determined by your tactics. It's determined by the way, determine what you're protesting. Like that's what determines whether or not your protest or your movement or your activism is in fact respectable. It's the thing in which you're protesting. Otherwise, it's disingenuous. It's just concern trolling. To pretend as though people will listen to your protest, the demands of your organization, if you just ask politely, has never actually been the reality. But it has so become the dominant narrative of the disaffected moderate liberal. And, Martin King Jr. speaks on this as well. And he speaks to the fact that the moderate white man, the moderate liberal, because really we can replace white person at this day and age for liberal, because we also have, non-Black minorities. We have, we have women, white women. We even have people of color, Black people, going out there and concern trolling around Black Lives Matter, around Antifa protests, around whatever particular, the deplatforming of Charles Murray, the deplatforming of Milo Yiannopoulos, the deplatforming of Gary McInnes. We have liberal guys like that's just freedom of speech. Nah, dude, nah. And what would Martin King Jr. say? It's like, well, Martin King Jr. would probably be in favor of it. At least the Martin King Jr. that actually existed, and not the Martin King Jr. you've constructed as, yes, you've weaponized against the status quo. And rather, you've weaponized in favor of the status quo rather. And so, we just have to actually, on the day of his death, if not the day of his birth, understand what actually got him killed. And it was not this sort of kumbaya, like, people are equal message. It was his deep class analysis and his desire to engage in, global socialism. Like, that's what got him killed. Like, it was not this kind of whitewashed message.